That time again, ladies and gentlemen. Time to spin the wheel to see what video I'll be making. Okay, it's time to make a video about I'm as you know.
Doing stand-up comedy!
Take me, you dummy!
Oh my god, I'm amazed I was able to get 15 minutes out of talking about a character. Next topic. Why, you little—
Then I guess the angels are already helping. Don't hold me back, BFOG!
Already losing faith in this spinner. Let's see what's actually next. DanceXL Radio. Doesn't sound like a bad idea. Let's do it! DanceXL Radio is something I feel like the radio industry needs, but does very poorly at. I always had the idea that radio stations that focus on genres like electronic dance, hip-hop, pop, and others would have tremendous potential. Instead of playing whatever song is in the top 40s, I'd be able to listen to a radio station that would play from specific genres of music. I see this idea showing up in the form of playlists. Playlists for genres that focus on recognizable or even specific subsets of a genre. Like the new melodic bass playlist on Apple Music. I like this playlist largely because melodic bass and songs that focus on a more melodic approach have been popping up as of late, so I feel like an entire playlist to find those would be perfect. And yeah, it does something that works well, but I feel like it could use some room for improvement. I wish platforms like Apple Music had specific genres for songs, rather than putting them under the generalized categories like dance, which is a genre that the majority of songs that I listen to nowadays fall under. Yeah, I know it will take much more work, especially because being too specific could result in much more work when putting out a song. Unless the artist manually does it themselves, you'd have to listen to the entirety of one song and decide what it falls under. But I feel like it would be easier to find more songs of a specific genre, and while they do exist, I've noticed artists rarely use specific genres, and just go for the dance or electronic genre because those are the two main genres. And speaking of, why does Apple Music not associate dance and electronic as the same thing like Spotify? Yeah, they're different, but they're kind of the same. Heck, the term EDM is electronic dance music, so why would they separate the two? In some cases, I've even seen curators add electronic songs to dance playlists and vice versa. So it doesn't know they're in the same field, but act like this? Of course, Spotify doesn't allow me to see the genre of a song, so I don't know what's worse. But I feel like EDM should have a radio station of its own that cycles through electronic music of all genres, and in some cases, I kinda got what I wanted. On March 20th, 2014, Monstercat uploaded the first episode of the Monstercat podcast. The podcast that would play Monstercat music, and it would be mixed by Josh, aka Rocketman. The show would also play exclusives, spotlights, and even have some artists come onto the show to talk about a song or even do a takeover. When it started, there really wasn't a host for the show. Sure, during episode 50, DanceXL Radio did make an appearance, and there was this female that originally did the podcast, but it wasn't until episode 72 where the show did get a host. But the Monstercat podcast got a name change. In 2016, specifically in July 2016, with Call the Wild, the current name for Monstercat's podcast. This was in episode 114, but Call the Wild was what I wanted from an EDM podcast. The creativity of the mixes and the way they're mixed were magical to me. Sometimes Monstercat founder Mike Darlington would make an appearance on Call the Wild. It was really cool. The show was broadcasted initially every Tuesday, but got moved to Wednesday, and would be broadcasted on Monstercat's Twitch channel, which also took a similar radio approach. Whenever Call the Wild or The Silk Showcase wasn't broadcasting, they do exactly what I've been wanting from an EDM radio station, playing music non-stop, and Monstercat music nevertheless. It was the perfect combination, and other labels like Liquid City and NCS do something similar, albeit NCS just usually plays their music, no podcasts from them, and Liquid City, a preferably drum and bass label, plays, you guessed it, drum and bass music. But with Liquid City, they also sometimes play music and even upload some music off-label, giving attention to other labels as well, which I find kind of cool. But these two have really pushed my idea of why not make a radio station that's focused on EDM music. It would be a perfect combo for a fan of EDM music, especially because radio nowadays is just a pain to sit through. So take a bunch of genres and give them specific radio stations or multiple radio stations on that topic, and it would be perfect! which is where we get to, how did you screw this up? Apple Music already has radio stations. Apple Music One, Hits, and Country are all actual radio stations that work almost the exact same way as listening to a song on the radio. But there are other radio stations themed after a specific genre. Though those stations are just song after song after song, it doesn't feel like a radio station, nor does it emulate one. With Apple Music One, it feels more genuine. Sure, you're probably only caring about the song that's being played, but in my opinion, if we're talking radio, we have to talk radio, not talk like radio. And that's what a lot of these other stations are, talking like radio. Here and there, I'd listen to the drum and bass and dance stations on Apple Music here and there. And this was usually because I wanted to venture out and listen to some more music. And it's usually whenever Monstercat releases nothing or a song that just doesn't interest me comes out. Komi released a track? Nope, can't hear you. Listen to Cleek's Anaconda. There were pretty fun experiences, even if they didn't feel like radio to me. But then I discovered DanceXL. DanceXL was Apple's music playlist that would update weekly with some interesting dance songs at that time. And it sounds pretty cool. I said sound, I haven't listened to the bloody thing. But that doesn't matter because it's time for DanceXL Radio. This is a radio show hosted and mixed by Anna Loon. And when I saw this station, I thought, this makes perfect sense and sounds promising. You take a concept such as Call the Wild and expand upon it by not just playing songs from Monstercat, but so many different record labels, and it sounds like an EDM fan's biggest dream. In comparison, this lasts about as long as Call the Wild, spanning an hour, being broadcasted on a radio station like Apple Music One, streamed on one of the most popular music services, Apple Music. The host, Anna Lune, is an electronic vocalist herself, having over 130,000 Instagram followers, and has made music before, and has also made a podcast before with Create Destroy. And unlike Call the Wild, Apple Music and DanceXL Radio have so much more music on its hands with so many songs to choose from. How could they possibly screw this up? So DanceXL Radio is similar to Call the Wild, but different in its delivery. It's like they knew there wasn't a radio station for EDM and thought they could make a radio segment dedicated to that. But instead of offering an experience similar to Call the Wild, where it's a show, but focusing on music, DanceXL Radio tries to implement some radio elements into it. Makes sense, I mean, radio is in the name. I was expecting to see something like that. It just feels like they focus so much more on the radio aspect, though, than even the music that's being played. There are several differences between DanceXL Radio and Call the Wild, but I prefer Call the Wild, as it offers a more fluid experience towards music. Here are some of a few examples and differences between DanceXL Radio and Call the Wild, and of course, I'll be giving my thoughts on each and every one of them. The format for DanceXL Radio is greatly different than Call the Wild, and the way it's done, I think it was slightly worse. Both radio shows start off the same way, fairly and similarly, and even after the intro, the host comes to talk about what will be featured on the show. Like the pacing so far, I'll give DanceXL that, it does that, I'll give it credit. But then I see one of the biggest changes in comparison to Call the Wild, and it's gotta be, rather than having songs transition into each other like Call the Wild does, Apple Music thought it would be cool to add these small but noticeable pauses between songs, which I find a bit odd. Like, I can tolerate that, but I just don't see the point. You could have easily transitioned into the next song, considering most of these songs that are being played during the playlist are house tracks. And look, I'm not a DJ. I don't know how difficult it could be to transition a song into another song. It may not be that easy. But I don't see it to be particularly hard to transition a house song into another house song. The format keeps changing as the show goes on for me. In some cases, DanceXL Radio has these pauses where the host talks about the song that was being played, or talks about themselves for a bit. Personally, I prefer the way Call the Wild took it and just did song after song after song, especially because the show itself has to take a breather for these. And when you only have 1 hour, there's only so much you could do with it. The format isn't my biggest problem, but it's definitely up there. The pacing of DanceXL Radio is different to Call the Wild. To put it simply, I've never had a moment where I felt like a Call the Wild episode had pacing that ever slowed down for me, and I've never had moments in which case the show stopped itself to do something. And that's another thing I don't like about DanceXL Radio. The pacing can go from entertaining to slow, and this is noticeable during talk sessions and even during the interviews, largely because the show itself pauses its own right and giving time for the artist or the host to talk. Now, Call the Wild does something similar, as there are episodes where artists take over, but unlike with DanceXL Radio, the artists don't talk a lot during that show. They only really talk about the making of a song, like Tony Romero on his takeover and future plans with Eki Orbo on his takeover. Plus, the song they're talking about usually plays in the background as they talk about it, and when they're done talking, there's no break between songs. We just hop into the song, playing in the background. There's no pace killing, and talk sessions don't last at all. DanceXL Radio is literally the opposite. Conversations between artists and the host go on for a while this really unnecessary bassy house-like beat in the background, which isn't associated with the song nor the artist being referred to in the conversation, plays in the background, and it's probably one of the most annoying parts of DanceXL Radio for me, as not only is the pace being slowed because they chose to have these segments, which, while cool, would have been better if the song the artist had or played, even like an instrumental version of that song would have been fine in my opinion, but also because of this unnecessary and quite frankly annoying bass in the background, sounding like a house track of sorts. I prefer Call the Wild because the show just flows better and the pacing isn't crushed by anything. If these moments were refined, such as having the upcoming track preview while they're talking or even playing the song in the background would have been better. Instead, we have this pace killer. One thing that I do have to note, even though it's a small detail, is how DanceXL and DanceXL Radio are two separate entities. They may share the same name, but the music selection is totally different. Unlike Call the Wild, which shows the track list after episodes on, say, Google Podcasts, there's no real way to look at the track lists of DanceXL Radio. Not even DanceXL's podcast is connected to DanceXL Radio. Anna may play some songs off the playlist, but that's about it. Which is funny because they share the same name, description, and even the same cover as DanceXL Radio, but their song selection is completely different. I can kind of understand why, as this gives no incentive to listen to DanceXL Radio if the entire radio show is listenable through the playlist, but I find it weird. It would have been a perfect way to listen to those songs from that week's show through that playlist. Oh, and speaking of the songs, this is a perfect transition into my biggest problem with DanceXL Radio. Let me get this one point down. You're a radio show. You're supposed to be showing me songs that give EDM a name, and I'm assuming they've listened to numerous dance tracks from over so many different genres. So I gotta ask now, why is the song selection so focused on one genre? The first episode of DanceXL Radio I watched live was on episode 108, 2 weeks ago of the making of this video. And my biggest problem, apart from the aforementioned things, was how they focused so bloody much on one genre. House. Almost the entirety of that 1 hour focused on just house. And to put it simply, this is one of the worst possible things you could do when you make an EDM radio station. There are so many different songs from so many different genres, but that entire hour felt like I was listening to nothing but just house. And while I do know house is a popular genre, it really took off back then, and we have artists nowadays that also focus on house, like OVSKY. That's all that DanceXL Radio had. They did play a few different songs from different genres, but they mostly played those around the end of the show. Why play them at the end? If the show really wanted to highlight other genres besides house, why not sprinkle some of the other different genre songs in between the show? Granted, it doesn't change the fact that there's more house than any other genre, but it's better than listening to... And it keeps going on and on and on with one random...
Love it when we hate, nobody can change.
Sprinkled in before we move back onto... Even with the weekend track, like a Moth to a Flame, which played during the show, sounds like a very unique take on house, if not indie dance. During that night, they never played any other genres like...
Yeah. Check this.
or any other genre. Yeah, that wasn't just simply house and another genre that I guess was like garage. Mixed in with an interview with Disclosure, who worked with Zed on the track You've Gotta Let It Go If You Want to Be Free, which is still just house to me. I don't know if they played any different genre of music that day. That wasn't just the exact same genre over and over and over again with some minor changes in style. I'd probably be fine with it, but apart from 2 songs that I've heard that day, Ain't Me Without You by Wise is a really good house track that reminded me a lot of Back to Start featuring Dylan Dunlap by Stonebank, Hang Up featuring Savoy by World, and Don't Say Sorry by Ellis. That song had a really good melody behind it, and I could see myself dancing to it. And Tell It to My Heart featuring Hoiser by Medusa was an amazing take on Slap House. And while it has gotten a sort of bad rap, largely because of how many songs are similar to it, I think when done right, Slap House could actually sound really cool, like with this song. Apart from those two songs, Lane 8's Illuminate, a song that was already played last week, but hey, I can't say much about that because After Midnight by Slushii was played on Call the Wild like 3 weeks in a row. So maybe I should shut my mouth. And Tonight Belongs to You by Bissett, there weren't a whole lot of tracks that caught my eye. Even with Tell It to My Heart, I was a bit hesitant to add that to my playlist, largely because it sounded so close to other tracks I was listening to that day. There are like other 20 house tracks like it. And when you hear a genre of songs so much, there's only so much another track in the same genre will sound to me. Not to mention, many of these songs aren't explicit, which I'd be fine with if DanceXL's playlist didn't have the explicit versions of these songs. Which lead me to ask the question, why not make the radio show explicit? Plus, this would open up the variety so much more. You're okay with DanceXL playlists featuring explicit songs but not DanceXL Radio? Doesn't make much sense, but hey, it keeps proving my point as to how there are two different things. But offering explicit tracks is far from saving my opinion on how DanceXL Radio had some potential, not just because there really haven't been a lot of radio stations that focus on electronic music, but the sheer amount of tracks on EDM that has to offer are so vast, with several of these tracks that could have been played on DanceXL Radio. I don't feel like DanceXL Radio has to mimic Call the Wild to be successful. I feel like it needs to offer more, not just a spew of house tracks, maybe tracks from different genres. I'd love to see drum and bass and dubstep appear on DanceXL Radio. Sure, it'd be odd to see those when DanceXL Radio is mostly known for house music at this point, but it'd liven up the mood and offer plenty of variety, which is something I wanted to see out of an EDM radio show like DanceXL Radio. I know I may be saying this because of the Monstercat fan inside of me, but I also really want to see songs that are more well known from record labels on DanceXL Radio. I know this really doesn't matter if the songs that come out of those record labels aren't that great, but seeing record labels like Disciple, record labels like Liquid City, and record labels like Monstercat, more well-known labels, could inspire people to check out those labels and find more songs to add to their playlists, especially considering many of these labels already have made appearances on Apple Music's other playlists, most notably the Melodic Bass playlist, which there are like 5 Monstercat songs on that playlist, and playing more newer releases in dance and electronic, especially from modern artists that release something big like an album or an EP. Black Tiger Sex Machine, Slumberjack, and Virtual Riot all released major albums earlier this month or last month. Virtual Riot just recently released Simulation Deluxe Edition, a deluxe edition of last year's Simulation featuring 6 new tracks off of it, including all of the original Simulation in that album. Black Tiger Sex Machine released his latest album, Once Upon a Time in Cyberworld, an album that has been in the weeks for almost 3 years, with the first single, Leaders, releasing in 2020, and he kept releasing more and more singles off of it until he finally released the album in January. The album even got featured on the new releases section on Apple Music's dance category. Finally, Slumberjack, the duo that started releasing a single after single between this year and last year, recently released their self-released debut album, Dichotomy. This album even got a description from Apple that reviewed the album, meaning they saw this and knew it existed. There are 3 big projects. These are the 3 big projects that came out this year and between January and February. So I feel like DanceXL Radio would be the perfect spot to promote them and talk about these albums, or even just play a song off of one of them. If it's explicit, unfortunate, but I still feel like there could be some value if one song off of an album, like one of these, or even offering just some variety, would be a perfect step forward for DanceXL Radio. Because what DanceXL Radio has right now are a bunch of house tracks, and many of them have been played back to back. Again, nothing wrong with house, but there's only so much much house a person can take before they end up getting annoyed. Every other problem I mentioned with DanceXL Radio, like the pacing being toyed with or the interviews taking up much more time than I'd bargained for, all of that means nothing in comparison to the music selection if that isn't up to par, which in my opinion, it isn't. That doesn't mean other radio stations don't have their own problems. Call the Wild doesn't really place the Instinct, Uncaged, and Silk spotlights in a consistent order, which may result in some confusion as to when a spotlight happens. And the fact that some Call the Wilds focus on more recent releases on Monstercat rather than the older ones is a bit odd, especially considering a lot of people really like the older Monstercat releases. I'm still waiting for that time Rocket Man mixes Stick Up featuring Juliette Lewis by Karma Fields and Morton on Call the Wild so I can finally make my requests on the community picks worth something. But with DanceXL Radio, in my opinion, is one of the worst examples of EDM radio because this is not what I wanted out of an EDM radio show. It's not worse than Call the Wild, it just has more options but does not take advantage of them. Again, the options DanceXL Radio have are just more than Call the Wild. More music, more of an audience, more of a platform, even more artists as they proved. But instead of taking advantage of what they have, DanceXL Radio is the EDM equivalent to modern day radio, and unless they change the problems it has, I don't think I, nor other people, will watch the show and think a different way. So hopefully you can understand why I'm so mixed on DanceXL Radio. The concept was incredible, but the execution was just poorly done. Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.